The year is 1849, West Coast United States. The first Chinese immigrants embarked on a new land in search of gold and jobs. And it wouldn't be long before Japanese immigrants would make their way to the United States as well, eager to make a new living. However, their journey for a new home would not be without struggle. Many would face racism, systematic and violent pushbacks that resulted in xenophobic laws, forced relocations, and death. A large reason for this pushback came from visuals used to portray Asians, such as political cartoons, propaganda, and the portrayal of Asians in general. This was the birth of Asian stereotypes. These visuals and their rhetoric would echo not only for Chinese and Japanese people, but for all Asians for years to come. Hi, my name is Kobe Rathsavong, and my disciplines are history and writing and rhetoric studies. In this video essay, I will discuss how early Chinese and Japanese immigrants in America have been portrayed visually in racist or negative stereotypes, allowing for the growth of an Oriental monolithic otherness that will continue to persist today. We will be looking at racist imagery of Asians that contain a multitude of untrue and hurtful stereotypes. These may make viewers uncomfortable or angry, but it's necessary to confront the past, no matter how bleak it may be. The story of early Chinese immigrants would begin with the gold rush. Eager to make their fortune, they gave the new continent the nickname Gold Mountain. But the gold rush wasn't to last, and many would find other economic opportunities in their new land, most famously as railroad workers. However, their cheap labor angered many white workers who began to see the Chinese as competition, fearing that they'd be stealing jobs and destroying the moral fabric of American society. Newspaper and artists would run with this conflict. Chinese exoticism offered satirical artists the opportunity to render instantly recognizable stereotypes clothed in black humor. Stereotypes that told many Americans that the Chinese immigrants didn't just pose an economic danger, but a moral and physical danger as well, a yellow peril that endangered America. Why did white Americans fear Chinese immigrants? What would they bring to America? One answer can be found in this cartoon titled A Statue for a Harbor, 1881, showing the supposed values and cultures they would bring to America. Mimicking the Statue of Liberty, this stereotypical statue, with its emaciated figure and tattered clothes, shines bright in the night. The words on top read from counterclockwise: filth, immorality, disease, and ruin to white labor. The skulls, trash, and rats shows Americans what destructions they would cause in America, forever changing the land. White Americans also believed that the Chinese were heathens, not believing in Protestant Christianity. As mentioned earlier, Chinese immigrants were portrayed to have diseases, living in filth and poor conditions. Areas that also had Chinese people were shown to harbor diseases as well, such as this one looking at Chinatown. The talk about disease sounds eerily familiar today. Physical stereotypes of Chinese were paradoxical in a way. Stereotypes show Chinese people as weak and effeminate, yet still dangerous. One example of this can be found in The Yellow Terror in all his glory, 1899. A short-statured caricature of a Chinese person stands on top of a dead, presumably white woman. He holds a gun in one hand, a torch in the other, a knife in his mouth. This image, and others like it, don't show Chinese men to be threatening to white males, but what they lack in masculinity, they make up in numbers or indirect attacks to society or white women. Chinese may be relatively defenseless in some ways, but Euro-Americans still perceive them as threatening rivals. In this way, white Americans could make the Chinese or any other Asian lesser than them and uphold white supremacy, but still keep them under control by demonizing them. They were also often shown as non-human hordes, endless and nameless, sometimes equating them to wild animals destroying America if they aren't controlled or barred from entering. This idea about the yellow horde also extends to physical characteristics as well. All Chinese, it was believed, are portrayed and look the same. This thought extended to all Asians, both Koreans, Japanese, and possibly Filipinos in America as well. They were simply believed to be Chinese, first and foremost. What this serves to do is dehumanize and de-individualize the Asians. It becomes easier to hate one single group, rather than believing that each person is an individual human being. It's important to note that some physical stereotypes were used to show morality as well. This cartoon is titled The Equal of Persons, Gibson and Loomis, created in response to Gibson and Loomis, two individuals who defended Chinese immigrants. There are 4 panels, with ironic titles at the bottom. Clockwise, we can see that a Chinese man stalks a Chinese woman, ready to strike with an axe. showing that they are prone to violence. Their violence not just against white Americans, but even in their own communities. The next one shows the cleanliness of Chinese immigrants, their shreds of clothes, skin, and bony bodies while they dine on rats, which has significance. The repeated portrayal of Chinese eating rats symbolizes their willingness to work for starvation wages. The next one portrays the Chinese as thieves and cheats, not only stealing, but the distinction is made that they're stealing from white Americans. The final panel is probably showing how the Chinese refuse to assimilate into American society and culture, and will be Chinese first before Americans. These caricatures didn't have any evidence to back them up, just refuting the claims of Gibson and Loomis. But the thing is that they didn't need evidence. Visuals like these can continue the cycle of repeated stereotypes until they become accepted by the dominating culture. Why take the time to verify when you can already accept and justify your beliefs? Not all visuals of Chinese immigrants during this time period were awful, but all of them flamed the fires of xenophobia that led to death and destruction. These kinds of stereotypes pushed the idea that Chinese immigrants could not be fully American. This created an unknowable other whose own image was preceded by the stereotypical images found in newspapers and magazines. Americans could then turn to this othered image in newspapers or visuals to create their own image of the Oriental. In the next couple of years, the xenophobic spotlight would turn to the Japanese, but the stereotype would remain the same. The story of Japanese Americans is similar to Chinese immigrants, but it wouldn't be until the 1940s when cartoonists would take their visual shots at Japanese people. World War II had changed the conversation from immigration and the economy to patriotism and national security. Local newspaper cartoons grew into large-scale propaganda efforts with the support of the government. Something that you may recognize when looking at these visuals is how stereotypes from Chinese immigrants would be carried over to Japanese people as well. Our first example comes from famous children's author Dr. Seuss, who dabbled in a bit of propaganda during this time period. This one, titled Honorable, Fifth Column, shows waves of Japanese caricatures, each with the same face, on the West Coast, receiving explosives and ready to sabotage the United States and its war efforts. The wording on top reads, "Waiting for the signal from home," suggesting that the Japanese residing in the United States were never Americans and can never be Americans. Their allegiance must lie somewhere else. He implies that all Japanese people are a potential danger. There's no distinction between someone who's a spy for the Japanese Empire and a regular Japanese American. In this way, the racial stereotypes found in World War II propaganda promoted cultural hatred that transcended borders. The Japanese race became a common enemy, regardless of nationality. The title's significance and definition reinforces this idea. A fifth column is a group of secret sympathizers or supporters of an enemy that engage in espionage or sabotage within defensive lines or national borders. All Japanese people must support the empire. All Japanese people must hate America. Another Dr. Seuss cartoon titled Jap Alley depicts endless hordes of cats with stereotypical Asian features, attacking an Uncle Sam figure. Here we can see a return to Asian people being an endless animalistic horde, which Uncle Sam in America struggles to beat, once again threatening America. Propagandists took great efforts to dehumanize Japanese people, creating not just an other, but an enemy that Americans should hate. These posters often show inhuman traits, stripping them of their individuality and thus their humanity. Long fingernails with yellow and sometimes brown skin, Coke bottle glasses with exaggerated slanty eyes, pointy ears and big pointy teeth, sometimes just depicting them as animals such as rats or snakes. Sometimes they carried knives soaked with blood or other weaponry, always ready to strike white women or America. All these visuals created a framework of stereotypes and characteristics about Japanese people, allowing Americans to believe that the demonized stereotypical Japanese is the true representation of all Japanese. One might argue that during the war, propaganda had extended to Germans and Italians as well. However, its racial othering only extended to Japanese people. Unlike the Japanese, America's white enemies were rarely described in racial or even ethnic terms. Bad Germans and bad Italians were usually portrayed as Hitler, Nazis, or Mussolini, but bad Japanese were always Japanese people. With time, the technology with visuals would improve, but the representation of Asians would not. That is a large topic on its own, but I want to look at this time period from a historical lens. Animated cartoons were also made to boost the war effort. Big names such as Disney and Paramount had their animated stars fight against the Japanese, who were no match against the slapstick humor of Bugs Bunny or Donald Duck. In most, if not all of these cartoons, the Japanese are shown to be stupid and naive. They constantly scheme for their lack of physical strength. Stereotypical Asian accents are given to the characters. Their mediocre grasp on English highlights their differences. Even if they were to speak English, Americans would only hear garbled, broken English. Opening the field of animation to stereotypes would allow propagandists to exaggerate and push stereotypical features and scenarios, which also had the added effect of spreading prejudice, not only to a much wider audiences, but to a younger, more impressionable one. War films were sometimes shown to soldiers to educate or inform them. One film titled Know Your Enemy Japan takes a deep dive into Japanese society to explain the inner workings of the enemy. This hour-long film documents every facet of Japanese society an American soldier might want to know about Japan and its people. Even if it isn't 100% factual, it's important to note that the film mentions the differences between Japanese Americans and Japanese people in Japan. But what's the point if they're all the same? Know Your Enemy Japan also instructs that all Japanese are the same, civilians included, because the Japanese government was a vicious system of political and religious regimentation that hammers, kneads, and molds the whole population until it becomes an obedient mass with but a single mind. To orientalize and alert the enemy, it certainly becomes difficult to separate people from government. Certainly, the Japanese Empire had committed numerous war crimes against humanity. I don't want to whitewash history or victimize Japan in this time period. But what differentiates the soldier and the civilian if they're shown that they are both from the same cloth? The unfortunate result is that everyone becomes a potential enemy.
Anyone who runs is a VC. Anyone who stands still is a well-disciplined VC.
Today, the visual image of Asians is improving, but many of those stereotypes still linger within the visuals. But why did I decide to take a look at this from a historical viewpoint rather than looking at movies or other visuals? Why should we care about visuals in history at all? The thing is, Chinese and Japanese people weren't the only other people in US history. We can see the echoes of visual othering throughout history and even today, with Mexicans, Middle Easterners, African Americans, etc., etc. To visually other a group of people is a dangerous move that uses rhetorics in the form of stereotypes. It creates a framework identity that others can ascribe onto other people. Othering molds that group and others into one identity, whether they're different or not. The stereotypes I mentioned throughout the videos have been ascribed to all ages throughout history. To study this framework is to study the other, the marginalized in history, to empower and possibly challenge these frameworks through these visuals.